Simon, you're very much, you come at this from a humanitarian side. You've lived and worked in a number of these countries. I suppose the bald question is, how important do you think climate change is to improving or worsening the lives of the world's most vulnerable people? Is it vital, or is it currently just fashionable?
I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think the people involved know. And I would even say that we will never know. Because if you're dealing with people, then inevitably, it shouldn't be contentious to say, you're inevitably dealing with everything together that affects people. And you don't wake up on a Tuesday and suffer from climate change poverty, and wake up on a Wednesday and suffer from conflict poverty, and wake up on a Thursday and suffer from corruption poverty. They all interplay. And they interplay to such an extent that you can't necessarily say, attribute any cause or say that, well, without one, what would it have looked like? So that does look like a really important question. I'm not quite sure how relevant it is, especially if you're looking from a humanitarian angle. That doesn't mean the answer to the question is no. It doesn't mean you ignore climate change, because you shouldn't be thinking about anything over the long term without thinking about how the world is going to change over 5, 10, 20 years. Climate change is a part of that. However, if you're currently displaced in one of the conflicts of the world, your focus of attention is obviously on the conflict, on your displacement, on what I will eat today, health services, and so on. You're not going to be thinking about the conflict, about the climate change, because that you'll see that as being longer term. Whether or not that was one of the underlying causes which made your displacement more likely to have happened, it's kind of irrelevant.
So in your experience, people on the ground don't normally come up to you and say, my problems are due to climate change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that climate change isn't a major factor in causing their problems.
Yeah, exactly. The only people, in places where I've worked, the only people who will say that climate change is the number one felt priority are the people who are looking for money to run workshops on the importance of climate change, to be honest. But again, that doesn't mean that climate change isn't a factor, and it doesn't mean the problem, in fact, the opposite is the case. There's an awful lot of people who should have climate change on their agenda and on their radar and don't, and I would probably include myself in that.
Do you share one of the key thrusts of this report? I guess you do, because you're one of the authors, but that people do think in silos, and that has to be broken down because people on the ground don't think in silos, it doesn't affect them in silos.
Yeah, very, very much so. We work in silos, we're kept in silos by bureaucratic forces. There is this hope that this new word resilience is somehow going to break down the silos and bring us all together. I have in the past expressed a certain amount of skepticism about that, because I don't think the silos were created by a lack of jargon, and therefore I don't think a new jargon is actually going to solve the problem either. But even when you're aware of the silos, I mean, I hope that I'm kind of, sort of, new man, whatever, I'm into climate change and other people's perspectives. But at the end of the first draft of the report, showing it to the head of the climate change here, it was like, well, Simon, there's a lot of stuff. It was kind of, I'd held the last pen rather than Katie, so I made the mistakes. And she goes, the head of climate change, well, there's a lot you clearly haven't understood, and was trying to put me right. And what I hadn't understood was I was using the words all wrong. I didn't know what is currently meant by adaptation or mitigation and so on, or funds and so on. So even when you are kind of open to other people's perspectives, you don't necessarily know their jargon, you don't know what money they're spending where or on what criteria. And you're not involved in it, and you're not at the table. And if resilience is to mean anything at all, and hopefully it will, it's supposed to mean that we think longer term. So the humanitarians shouldn't just be thinking about the next 3 months, particularly since we know that humanitarians usually hang around for 40 or 50 years in the same countries, because things don't get better that quickly, protracted crises and war and so on. But we're supposed to have a longer-term thinking, and a longer-term thinking means a very, very different role. It means thinking about a strategy not only for yourself but for other people. And if we don't have where their tables are and where those discussions are on our radar, then I think we're missing an important role that we need to be playing.
Do you think it helps if there's actually a sector of climate change and development? Should that be something that everyone has in their arsenal?
We've struggled. I mean, we've struggled for decades now with this division into emergency or humanitarian and development. and it's been a terrible bane. You can see where it comes from, and there is a difference between drop everything, save the life, and think longer term. But we also know that for decades we've been trying to build bridges and link the two, and we've had lots and lots of jargon words for trying to link it, and we've failed. I think that the climate change potentially makes that much more difficult and much worse, because you've now got a third sector, which isn't even a third sector at all, because it's actually a problem. So it's not about a response. You're cutting the cake in a completely different, in a fourth dimension or in a fifth, whatever it is, and we can't go. Climate change is not a problem; it is a cause of people's problems. I'm speaking now about the adaptation mitigation. I'm not speaking about trying to prevent it. So which is a separate study. So humanitarians need to have it on agenda, development people, but there isn't such a thing as there isn't like climate change, agriculture, health. No. Climate change is one of the causes of problems in agriculture. If it causes population movements, it could be one of the causes of problems for healthcare delivery. But boxing it off on its own, separate to sectors, and then cutting those again into humanitarian and development, if anyone can work that out and find ways, we're not now talking about a bridge between two sectors, we're talking about spaghetti junction. And,
So rather than a separate sector, you think it's in effect pardon the pun, the sort of climate, the weather in which all those other sectors operate, that it's going to affect health, it's going to affect economy, it's going to affect a crisis or indeed a conflict.
Yeah, in an ideal world, and the world is not ideal, in an ideal world we wouldn't have separate tables for talking about climate aid and adaptation to climate change. We would have a climate adaptation specialist at every table talking about adaptation to future problems, talking about vulnerability to crisis, talking about resilience. So in an ideal world, I would love to see a world where we didn't need climate adaptation funds and things like that, and parallel programming. But that doesn't mean that the perspective shouldn't be there. But it would be nice if it weren't separated out. Given that it is a sector and has become a profession in and of itself, we at least have to make sure that our silos have got windows on, so that we can see out what's going on outside.
Do you suspect that climate change has sometimes been used as a phrase in order to get more money, basically, or get more political attention from people who might have become inured or deaf to other claims?
Yes.
Have you got an example?
Well, there's lots. I mean, even the one you alluded to in the paper around in East Africa. It's another in the same. But again, that doesn't negate the importance of it. I mean, resilience, is another example. If there is money for using a certain buzzword, then we're going to use the buzzword. And because climate change genuinely does interact with so many things and creates problems in so many areas, you can deal with any problem you want, and you can trace, you can have a thread which goes back to climate change and justify going to that pot of money.
And that's okay using it as long as it doesn't, the way you use it doesn't worsen the problem, I guess.
Well, there's two things. I mean, first of all, yes, we believe that if that one thread is a way of getting money, then that's fine. But the problem is that's not what happens. That thread becomes your analysis and leads to your solution. I mean, that's not about climate change. That's about how things work. You frame your analysis and your response around the trigger that's giving you the money. And what we believe is if you throw resources at a problem without having understood it, you are as likely to make it worse as better. That applies to a doctor. I mean, I don't want doctors treating me without trying to work out what the problem is first. Because if they just kind of, pull out a medicine because that's what funds are available for, well, I'm not sending my kids to that doctor, but we send our planet to that doctor, and it kind of surprises me. No, it doesn't really surprise me at all, but it ought to surprise me.
Just one final thought on sort of actual conflict and war. You've been close to or soon after a number of conflicts. How relevant do you believe climate change is to both their causes and their, I suppose, making it better afterwards?
I don't want to go near the question of how much of the conflicts I've lived in have been caused in any way by climate change. I want to look at
because you don't know, or because you think it's too sensitive?
Because I don't know, and I'm not sure that how important it is. I'm really interested in the other way, as you mentioned in the intro, about conflict as being a source of vulnerability. including to climate change. I think that's really important. And also conflict and post-conflict is a source of vulnerability to highly ineffective and highly dangerous use of climate aid as well. Because, you know, in a horrible phrase, it's not rocket science. I'll say it anyway, it's not rocket science. What caused why do you get conflicts in countries? Because there's contested governance, so you've got probably unequal power relations. If you've had a conflict for more than a week or two, your institutions, your law and order, the social fabric have probably been weakened. All the things which you need in order to be able to spend money well and wisely in the interests of people tend to go up in smoke in long conflicts. So people have got, there'll be probably identity problems, there'll be lots of resentment problems. You give money to the right people for the right reason, and everyone else will think you've given it for the wrong reason. So you're going to exacerbate things. So everything is just a million times more sensitive and a million times more likely to go wrong post-conflict than it would in a country like ours where things still go wrong. When you throw money at problems.
I suppose what I'm driving at, though, is do you think looking at those or the resolution of those with a climate change lens is generally helpful or not in your experience?
I've never tried to use a climate change lens in terms of thinking about the resolution of the conflict specifically, but in terms of how would you rebuild, what should reconstruction look like, very, 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 very much so. So I'm not saying it can't be part of the how should a conflict be resolved. I think that you're on very, very tricky ground, but you're on absolutely dead certain ground if you're saying, how do I move forward? And how do I build long-term stability, economic recovery, and so on? If you haven't thought about what is going to be possible for people in 5, 10, 20 years' time, go home. Don't spend money badly.
Thank you very much indeed.